All right, so all of the things that we have talked about so far in terms of evolution have been, at first we talked about the mechanisms and history and evidence, right? Then we talked about microevolution, which is change in allele frequencies in a population over the course of time, right? Small changes, looking at one trait over the course of several generations and how those frequencies change, and the mechanisms that cause those frequencies, changes like genetic drift, non-random mating, immigration and emigration, those types of things, right? So how do we get macroevolution? Macroevolution is speciation, right? That's where new species pop out, not out of nowhere, but how does one population turn into two separate populations and eventually get to the point of where those two populations can no longer mate and produce viable offspring. So in order to talk about how you get new species, we have to understand what a species is, right? And we've discussed this in class already, but the biological species concept is the classic way it is kind of explained: a population, a group of populations that have the potential to interbreed in nature, produce viable, fertile offspring, but cannot produce viable, fertile offspring with members of other populations. That is a somewhat debated definition, just because this does not include asexually reproducing organisms, there are different species within them too. So there's a better definition we use for species, which is, are they on the same evolutionary path? Like, is that population moving together on an evolutionary path, or are they starting to branch apart? But that's really hard to kind of quantify, and it's more complicated. So we usually use the biological species concept to define what a species is. As I said, one of the shortcomings of it is that, asexually reproducing things don't fit that. And this isn't a shortcoming, but remember, you can, like a mule, right, is the result of being born, of mating between a horse and a donkey. Those two individuals produce a mule, which is sterile. So that's not a shortcoming, because it's not a fertile offspring that they produce, but it is a viable offspring. So what stops the mating in the first place? So we're going to talk about a bunch of mechanisms that prevent individuals in a population from mating with each other. The first thing is reproductive isolation. So these are biological barriers that prevent two species from producing these viable offspring. And there's going to be two that we're going to talk about, and two mechanisms overall, with a bunch of mechanisms within it that you are going to have to kind of know for the AP Bio exam. The first is prezygotic factors that affect the mating, and then there's postzygotic factors. Now, you can imagine, what is a zygote? A zygote is, right, when a sperm and egg fertilize each other, and it forms a zygote, which is the first cell that an organism is. So anything that blocks the formation of a zygote would be considered a prezygotic factor. Anything after the zygote forms, like the sperm and egg fuse, but it doesn't divide. It starts dividing, but it won't be born eventually. It doesn't develop properly. Or they're born and they do not have the ability to reproduce, or they have a lower likelihood of survival. All of those things would be more like postzygotic factors, and we'll talk about those. So here's a list of the different prezygotic factors that can happen that prevent individuals from mating with each other. The first is habitat isolation. That's where they live in the same geographic area, right? So they live in similar areas, but they live in different habitats. And because they now are starting to, as these two populations exist in different habitats, they are going to start to evolve to that habitat, right? And there's no purpose to it, but through random changes, they're going to have adaptations that some individuals will survive better in that one habitat, and because another group is in a different habitat, they have characteristics that have them survive a little bit better in those. And as a result, eventually they can have enough changes that will cause them to not be able to mate anymore. There's going to be some incompatibility there. And because they're in different habitats, maybe they're not interested in mating with each other anymore. I'm going to show an example of those on the next page. Behavioral isolation. This one's actually a really simple one to kind of explain how it works in terms of speciation. So you have a bird species, right? And birds, their mating is very dependent on the songs that they sing. And so a female is listening for a specific male song. If the male song is not right, she will not mate with him. And there's certain situations, some of these songs are genetically determined. So there can be a mutation that causes a change in the song for it to not to quite sound right, and that'll cause all the individuals to not want to mate with that individual. But if there's a couple individuals that had the same, a male and a female that had the same issue, maybe they would end up getting together. So that could lead into a divergence in two different species over the course of time, because they're just not interested, these two populations, in mating with each other ever again. There's temporal isolation. That's when maybe they're in heat, right? Or they only are able to reproduce at certain times of the year, and those times of the years don't match up anymore. It can even be like maybe some members of the species become more nocturnal, and some members are awake during the day. And because they're active during those times, they're going to stop mating with each other because one's asleep and the other one's awake, and vice versa. Mechanical isolation is that literally it sounds really crude, but their parts don't fit together anymore. So for some reason, they just do not mate. Or they could attempt to mate, they want to mate, but it's just not happening. This is kind of actually a joke with that. You can see this like giant dog here and this tiny little chihuahua. That's kind of like mechanical isolation, but interestingly enough, those are still both the exact same species. They're just different breeds within the same species. And then there's gamete isolation, where they want to mate, they attempt to mate, they do mate, but once the sperm try to get to the egg, it can't fuse, because there's receptors on the outside of the egg that the sperm actually know that it's a proper egg for their species. If the receptors don't match, the sperm can't fertilize the egg. So, and think about how simple of a mutation that could be. That's just a receptor on the surface. You change that receptor shape, that sperm's no longer going to be compatible to that egg. We have a new species at that point. But the eggs you'd have to have those sperm still match with some other species, like with individuals that have eggs that have receptors that fit, in order to actually branch off and become completely two different species. So all of those are considered prezygotic factors. Okay, you can see this habitat isolation. The snake could mate with this snake, right? A and B, but one lives on land and one lives on the water, so they're probably not going to really interact very much. It causes some isolation, and eventually that could lead to a speciation event. I think these breed at different times of the year. That's the temporal isolation. These two species of skunk. As birds, I don't know these are called blue-footed boobies. Actually, that's the name of the bird, and I'm not sure exactly what I'm trying to remember what their behavioral isolation is. But and then again, mechanical and gametic isolation. The sperm, like they just can't fuse. It doesn't work. In terms of being able to actually attempt to mate, there's some issue with this. It's not about the sperm and egg fusing. There's some issue with the sperm and egg getting together, or gametic isolation, when they try to get together, sperm and egg try to fuse, but it just can't fuse and produce viable offspring. So postzygotic factors there's one is reduced hybrid viability. That's when, so now the zygote forms, sperm fused with egg, but there's some genetic incompatibility and the embryo will not form properly, right? Or it'll form and it'll grow, but they'll die before reproductive age. That's considered reduced hybrid viability. Reduced hybrid fertility is the offspring survives but is sterile, right? That's like the mule, like we mentioned before. And then there's hybrid breakdown, which takes it one more step, is that two species produce a viable fertile offspring, but when those two offspring reproduce, their offspring are weak and are sterile. So they can produce offspring, their offspring can reproduce offspring, but eventually there's a breakdown and then their offspring will not be able to reproduce or will have a reduced viability. So we can have reproductive isolation, which are all of the mechanisms we kind of just discussed, right? And then we can have geographical isolation as well that can lead to speciation, which is I think the easiest way to understand and think about how it works. So there's really two ways that you have two ways you can get separation. One is allopatric speciation, which is that's a geographic barrier, ends up between two species, so they no longer can mate. Like they want to, but like there's a giant ravine between the two and they can't get across it. So they're going to become different species eventually, simply because they're going to have the environment may be a little bit different on the other side. They're going to go in separate evolutionary paths. Sometimes just due to random chance, and eventually that can lead to speciation. So allopatric is when you have a geographic barrier that separates and stops populations from mating, which leads them to going on separate evolutionary paths. Sympatric speciation could be all of those mechanisms we mentioned before. That's when they're in the same location. There's no geographic barrier. So all of those mechanisms we talked about would be examples of sympatric speciation. The way I remember it is sympatric, similar place, so that they're not geographically isolated from each other. Another way, other than the mechanisms we mentioned, that you can get sympatric speciation is autopolyploidy. That's, remember, when you have whole 2 sperm fertilize 1 egg, and you can get lots and lots of different species, usually of plants, by just having whole extra sets of chromosomes. Instead of having 2 sets and not being diploid, you can be triploid, quadruploid, tetraploid, even 10N. Like I talked about how the strawberries are 8N, right? They have 8 copies of every chromosome. So they cannot. So you can create those instantly without any time. They could breed with each other, but they cannot breed with other members of the other species, of different species. All right, adaptive radiation. This mechanism is super important to understand. So many new species can arise from a single or a few common ancestors actually very quickly, and it does that through a process called adaptive radiation. First, you do need mutations, which are slight differences, right? You need adaptations that exist due to random mutation, and then you need lots of open niches, or niches, however you want to say it, I don't care. A niche is what? Try to come up with a definition of a niche. All right, a niche is basically an organism's role, or their, and it's not just their job. It's the food they eat. It's where they live. It's what predators eat it, right? It's kind of its role or its place within an ecosystem. So that's a niche. If you have lots of unoccupied niches, there's lots of roles within an ecosystem that are available to be kind of filled, right? In order for individuals in a species, if they're all kind of similar, let's say they're all competing with each other for the same exact food source, for example, but there's slight variations, and some are better at eating that food source than others. But because there's open niches, right, there's other food sources that could be eaten. Those individuals that are maybe better at eating a different type of food will go off and eat that food because that'll reduce competition. That can cause a really quick difference in habitat isolation because they're starting to eat different things. They're going to start to live in different places and kind of live in different ways because they're eating different things, because the classic examples we'll talk about are Darwin's finches. Their beaks are a little bit different shaped, so they're better at eating that. Why compete with each other? What's the point with competing? Why would you do that? So if you think about radiation, what that means is if there's a bunch of open niches, these spread out to those open, one species can kind of spread out and fill those unoccupied niches, and each of those over the course of thousands of years can become different species. They stop mating with each other. So as I mentioned, Darwin's finches are a great example of this, and one of his best pieces of evidence for evolution was the Darwin's finch, because there was an ancestral finch that lived on the mainland that eat seeds, and then there was a seed-eating finch on the islands of the Galapagos. But then there are all these other small finches as well. So that's where he came up with this idea. Well, there's variations in these finches and their beaks, even within each population. Well, what if, because they came to this island and there was no other birds to eat some of these other things, they just would, in order to reduce competition, the ones with the smaller beaks, sharper beaks, would eat insects out of trees. And the ones with these other unique shaped ones would eat grubs out of the ground. And this tool-using finch has a beak that's really good at grabbing something and picking out and getting like ants and things out of trees. Some are better at eating fruit, all of these different things. So this allowed for rapid change really quickly. And this is a really funny joke. I would let you read it for a second and think about why it's so funny, because it's a good one. Nice. And this is another, whatever, it's a thing. Various, it's like a Swiss Army knife, that's funny. And I'm going to talk about adaptive radiation through the scope of this as well in a second for another example. But so there's really two major ways that we talk about speciation happening, and there's gradualism, which is where speciation kind of occurs slowly over the course of time, and gradualism does occur in some instances. It's kind of like a regular rate of evolution. And punctuated equilibrium is this idea that there's long periods where things don't really change much evolutionarily. There's not a lot of speciation, followed by drastic, sudden change in speciation events, usually because of natural disasters or extinction events that cause major disruptions to ecosystems, and then due to adaptive radiation, the species that do survive will spread out and refill those niches and form new species. So a great example of this is mammals. So when the dinosaurs were around during the Jurassic and Cretaceous, you'll notice the thickness of that. You see how thick it is? That's biodiversity. So you'll notice that the mammals didn't really have very much biodiversity, but the dinosaurs had lots of biodiversity. They were the dominant predators of the time, but there are lots of other dinosaurs that filled other types of roles. They just were tons of dinosaurs around, and they were the dominant species. Species is a thing, but there are lots of different species of dinosaurs that did lots of different things. Mammals were pretty much relegated to being rodents that were really small scavengers that burrowed under the ground, and that's all they did. They would go, they maybe would catch and hunt small things, but most of the time, insects, things like that, most of the times they were hunted, and they had to be were relegated to burrows. But because they were burrowing or animals, when the dinosaurs went extinct due to the, I think everyone knows about this, right? That the dinosaurs went extinct due to the asteroid impact. All the dinosaurs died. The mammals survived because they burrowed. They were able to burrow under the ground, and then they were able to come up rarely because it was so cold due to the blocking out of the sun due to the impact. But the mammals were able to come back out and scavenge the dead carcasses of the dinosaurs, and they were able to make it through the cold. And eventually, it was really hot initially, then it got cold. And then eventually, once everything kind of cleared, the mammals came out, and they're like, wait, there's all these open niches. So they started to spread, and they started to take on a lot of the roles that the dinosaurs did, and they become those massive kind of mammals that we're seeing. And we see some of them today, like bison and stuff like that, but like saber-toothed tigers and mammoths and all of this other stuff that existed that kind of came about because the mammals filled the niches that the dinosaurs left behind when they went extinct. And you'll also notice, you'll see the birds and the crocodiles are still around from kind of the old dinosaurs. You're seeing crocodiles branching off way earlier than birds. Birds are actually the closest living relatives to dinosaurs today. All right, so there's also sexual selection or mate choice, and this can affect spin-Patrick speciation, right? I just want you to know that sexual selection is this idea that like females or males will select traits in the opposite sex that they find attractive for whatever reason. And there's traits and behaviors that influence mate choice, like there's the birds of paradise, which I will show you a video of in class, where the males are really brightly colored and do these really interesting dances in order to attract females. And like giraffes, male giraffes will, remember I told you about the necks of giraffes being long because they'd reach up really high to the leaves, right? That was Lamarckian. Well, the Darwinian explanation of this would be like, there was natural variation in the population. The ones that had longer necks would be able to reach the higher leaves. And as a result, they would pass their genes on more often, and then their offspring will have longer necks. It's not Lamarckian. It's just because there was natural variation due to survival of the fittest, right? Which I hate that term, but you know. But that's actually not true either, because males have long necks because they like to beat the snot out of each other with their heads. That's actually why they have such long necks. They use them as weapons and battering rams, and I'm going to show you that video in class as well. And usually these traits indicate good fitness in individuals. So like usually these sexually selected traits, like they're indicators that this male is really healthy or really good at fighting or can protect me or whatever. There's also sexual dimorphism, if this idea that there's differences in the sexes in terms of their traits, right? So insects tend to have, like some human beings, right, males tend to be, in mammals, males tend to be larger than females. And that a lot of times has to do with how well do we take care of our young? Do we have a lot of children and we only take care of we don't take care of them at all? Or do you have only a few children and you try to take care of them? If you have a situation where you have like monogamous relationships and you take care of children, a lot of times males tend to be larger than females in terms of their size, because females, the child would be kind of tied to them due to breastfeeding and things like that, for mammals obviously, but because of that, then males were the ones who had to go out and hunt and bring food back, so everyone could eat, so they had larger traits, whereas in something like, like larger size, more musculature, that kind of thing. But with things like spiders and insects, females are much larger because their strategy is produce as many babies as possible. I'm not going to take care of really any of them very much. So the female has to be large because she has to be large enough to produce all those eggs and collect and hunt in order to find enough nutrients to do that. And in fact, this male black widow right here is super tiny. He will actually sacrifice himself after he mates with the female and jump into her jaws, and she'll actually consume him. And he will provide sustenance for his own offspring. How about that for a fun fact? All right, here's a couple questions. I'm going to let you, we'll probably go over these in class actually. You can look at them now and try to answer them, see if you can figure out what the answers are. I'll actually pause it and I'll have you answer A, B, C, D, E on the screen for question 1, which is the first one on the left, and then question 2, which is the second one on the right. I think I'm going to stop there.